Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to another Fine Points with, of course, Bruce Fein. Bruce, what is it you'd like to speak about today, and tell me why you selected the topic that you'd like to discuss today?
Well, I wanted to talk today about the hoax of international law. It's been in the news regularly, certainly initially with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and then after October 7th with Israel's lashback in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon. Now it looks like Iran, and now we have U.S. troops going to Israel to man a THAAD missile defense system in anticipation of an Israeli attack on Iran. And you'll see all these commentaries, including actually some cases before the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, making tentative preliminary findings of violations of international law. But as everybody on this program can see, and you can see, it's had zero impact on the ground. It's just words that mean nothing. I wanted to try to utilize this session, Jeffrey, to explain, what are the international law precepts and how really it's just, as Shakespeare would say, sound and fury signifying nothing. It's a way to try to deceive people into thinking war isn't quite as bad as you think it is, because there are certain restraints on the combatants, but there are no constraints if you win. Basically, let me say the definition of a war of aggression is a war that you lose. It's not a war of aggression if you win. And
spoils.
Yeah, and I can bring up the example of World War II. Curtis LeMay was our general presiding over our Air Force when we were doing firebombing of Tokyo. This was before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the firebombing of Tokyo actually was more grisly than atomic bombings, and killed maybe close to 200,000 Japanese civilians. It was downtown Tokyo, it wasn't a military target. And he said later that it was essential that the United States win the war, because otherwise he and others would be tried as war criminals. And he told that to Robert McNamara, the defense secretary. And he was right. The tactics on both sides are virtually the same in war. You do anything you can to win. And if you prevail, you call the other side guilty of war crimes, and you don't look in. Even the so-called gold standard, Jeffrey, the Nuremberg trial, one of the charges against the Nazis were the Katyn Forest massacre of 20,000 Polish officers. And it's clear, and it's later came out, no, the Soviet Union perpetrated the massacre, not the Nazis. And the Soviet Union was sitting as part of the tribunal. Well, that's what you get to do if you win. You get to ignore your war crimes. And so I want to use this session to go through carefully, what is the standard for war crimes and why it's just words, because there's no enforcement mechanism other than winning the war.
Okay. So, and this is a topic you've written on national security and these issues.
That's for sure. People can go on Google and find many things that I've written on this score. I've been filed papers before the International Criminal Court, for the International Court of Justice. So let's begin.
Now, I have a question before you get further into this. When you were part of the several presidential administrations you were part of, any discussions come up on this topic? Were you involved in any discussions with respect to the limits and boundaries of fighting a war where, even if you lose, you're still not accused of war crimes, or did it not really ever come up? Was there ever even discussed or interest or concern about discussing, making sure that the rules of engagement were consistent with international law?
No, they weren't, because we really weren't engaged at that time. The Vietnam War had ended, and we didn't get engaged in any serious exercise, prolonged exercise, until with Bill Clinton, and I wasn't in the administration then. He decided he was going to attack Bosnia and then Serbia in the Balkan Wars. without any declaration of
We
war.
have seriously investigated war crimes of our own military in any war that we've been engaged in.
No, we've
What's the mechanism for reporting, investigating, and adjudicating, war crimes? I mean, there were allegations of war crimes in the WikiLeaks. So when there were these allegations of all kinds embedded in WikiLeaks, did the government, and you're not an insider, you're only an insider for a few years, do you know of any effort for the government to actually investigate any of these allegations that were embedded in these leaked documents?
Well, there were. It wasn't just the WikiLeaks, but there was evidence that there were U.S. contractors. It's called Blackwater. Had indiscriminately fired on civilians in Baghdad, and there were trials, but they didn't. But that was against the contractors, not any U.S. military people, U.S. government officials. And there were some trials, but they basically was a slap on the wrist. And that was tiny compared, shooting a few civilians to the massive displacements and loss of life. Then there was no investigation of whether or not we had committed the crime of aggression. And let's just pause there for a moment, Jeffrey. At Nuremberg, the tribunal, which was really, in terms of legal theory, orchestrated by the United States, there were 4 nations that sat on the tribunal: United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia. And our chief prosecutor was then a Supreme Court Justice, Robert Jackson. And we charged the Nazis with a crime of aggression, which was defined as attacking another country's sovereignty, not in self-defense. It was simply for purposes, preemptive wars, something like that. And listed among other things was Anschluss with Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, go on the list. And that war crime, that crime of aggression, was the source of many guilty verdicts against the chief Nazis, including Hermann Goering, who was deputy at one time of Adolf Hitler. So that's the definition of a criminal crime of aggressive war. Called it crimes against peace. You're not fighting in self-defense. Well, what we're doing in Iraq, we weren't fighting in self-defense. The WMD was fanciful. It was just made up. It wasn't there. And even if it was WMD, the last thing Saddam Hussein could have done would be to use them against the United States. You remember at that time, we had a complete no-fly zone. Saddam couldn't visit 2/3 of his country, and he was being starved to death with sanctions. So we go in and invade. For what reason? Was there ever any investigation, of our committing the war crime of aggression? Nothing, zero. Now,
in that case, with at least with respect to the war on Saddam Hussein and Iraq in 2003, at least there were congressional hearings and there was a declaration of war, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's partially right, but not complete. There was never any declaration of war. Basically, what happened is the Congress passed a resolution saying, Mr. President, if you think you need to go to war with Saddam Hussein, you can. But that's an abdication of the war power. You can't give the war power away. The whole reason why the declare war clause was entrusted to the Congress, because everybody, and I mean that everyone from George Washington, James Madison, distrusted the executive with the decision whether to go from peace to war. Said no.
So you think Congress gave? So you think Congress conveyed an unconstitutional power to the president? Who would have standing in challenging this resolution? If Congress conveys an unconstitutional does an unconstitutional resolution giving the president power not contemplated in the Constitution, who would have standing to challenge that?
Well, let me just give a little brief background, Jeffrey, because first, a single member does not have standing to challenge that. That's a case called Byrd versus when Senator Byrd sought to challenge the constitutionality of the line item veto, where the president was given line item veto authority that's not entrusted to the executive under the Constitution. But ultimately, In using line item veto, New York City lost some funds, and New York City sued Bill Clinton because he had lined out certain funding for New York City that Congress had appropriated, and they won. New York City won the case. Clinton versus New York, saying, and the Supreme Court, no, you can't delegate, the veto power, the line item veto to the president. He's got to sign it or veto the whole thing, go back and try to get a new law. So we clearly have a precedent of standing to challenge unconstitutionally delegated powers entrusted to Congress to the president. Now, with the war power, it's a little trickier because you could there's clearly would be standing for a House or Senate committee to sue, claiming, hey, usurped the war power. But you need a majority to do that. And you may recall in the Iraq vote, the overwhelming majority, both Democrats and Republicans, was in favor. They all thought Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. And plus, they don't want to vote on the war power. They want to run away and escape the responsibilities. They fear, my gosh, if this war goes south, I'll get a primary opponent. So they've scampered away and abdicated this responsibility.
And someone like Ted Kennedy, who at that point in time was alive and gave a very articulate speech on the House of the Senate opposing this resolution, he alone could not have had standing to challenge the constitutionality.
That is right. The closest case, Jeffrey, was with regard to Serbia. Tom Campbell, he was a friend of mine who worked with him at Justice Department. He was in Congress. You may recall President Clinton sought a declaration of war to go in and start bombing in Serbia. Congress voted it down. He went and did it anyway. Congressman Campbell sued, claiming this was unconstitutional, and the court said no standing. Right? Single members don't have standing. You can see how bizarre the reasoning is. Says, well, it's a political question. You need to go back to Congress to try to get them to sue. But say Congress is the problem. That's why I'm in the court. We can't get Congress to stand up and address.
So essentially, the Supreme Court would do nothing if the Constitution ceded all of its. If the Congress decided to cede its taxing authority to the president. If they let the president do if they just basically said to the White House, you do the budgeting, you set the tax, and we'll delegate to you this authority and this power. You're saying that there would be no challenge to basically if any president, whether it be Trump or Harris or whatever, just got the majority in both houses and basically met with their leadership and said, why don't you just delegate every authority to me? You won't have responsibility for anything. I'll have responsibility for everything, and just give me every authority, and I'll just do what I want, and I'll do what I want because you've given me the right to do whatever I want. You're telling me that nobody would have any standing, and the Supreme Court would sit passively by if that happened?
Well, I think that's, again, it's incomplete because remember, right now, Jeffrey, we're focused on the member of Congress that might have standing. But remember, as in the Clinton versus New York case, if, for example, in delegating the taxing authority to the president, you do whatever you want, and then they impose a tax on you or on me, we would have standing because we now are suffering a concrete injury, right?
So would a soldier stationed in Iraq have standing to bring a case against? Yes, I guess would they have standing? But using that standing, would that get them court-martialed? I mean,
yeah. So this is again, it's a wonderful question because I flirted with the issue in trying to find people with standing, and that is, in the past, we were able to locate soldiers who might be deployed, but weren't actually deployed in Iraq. But if you could actually find a soldier who was actually deployed in Iraq and now subject, to death, he's risking the last full measure of devotion, I think there would be standing. But we've never been able to find anyone for the reason that you've identified. He could file suit, but he'd be kicked out. He'd be ostracized. Who knows? He might just disappear. In 2 seconds. And these people sign up because they want a career in the military. Well, that's the end of their career. Now you're out of it, you're over. And you can imagine the resources that would be brought to bear by the government defending the case. And because there's no past case law on the issue. Okay, you want to go to the Supreme Court, consider this is 4 or 5 years of your life. before you get any resolution. It's hard to find people who are willing to make that kind of sacrifice and be a plaintiff. But go back the core legal question, yes, that person would have standing.
So, and basically, from my understanding and my recollection of the 2003 resolution, that's the resolution that basically has been used to justify our engagement in Iraq and Syria. I mean, there's been a very broad interpretation of what power was delegated to the president under that authorization. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. They use it all, even all the way to Somalia. I mean, everywhere. They just say it's kind of a blank check to do whatever we want to do. And Congress has not resisted that because they're venal and corrupt. They're irresponsible, and they say, "Hey, war is a tough issue. I don't want to vote on." They say that openly and candidly. I remember conversation. This is at the time when Obama, in 2013, he sought a declaration of war against Syria because of alleged chemical weapons use, and he couldn't get it out. He couldn't even get his bill out of committee. Even the Tom Cottons and Ted Cruz wouldn't vote for it. No, we're not going to do that. Of course, he went ahead and did it anyway, and then they didn't stand up and do anything. And once I remember the Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, he went to then House Speaker Paul Ryan and said, "Listen, all I want is an up or down vote on whether we should go to war with Syria." And Ryan said, "No, because the speaker controls the House calendar. We're not going to have a vote on it." He says, "Why? We just want to vote in a debate." And Ryan says, "Because my side would lose." Okay. I mean, really? Well, that's supposed to be how democracies work. Then you need to make better arguments and get more votes on your side. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why our nation has turned into a warfare state, because Congress has basically turned into a poodle of the executive branch.
So all these people basically knowingly and willingly, voluntarily subverting the Constitution, and they know they're doing so.
That is correct. Now, let me give again another anecdote. I worked for many years with the late Walter Jones. He was on the Armed Services Committee from North Carolina. And we would go and talk to the speaker who said, "We're going to impeach you." He wanted to impeach Ryan and Boehner because he says, "You're denying me my obligation to vote on war and peace. You're preventing me from exercising my responsibility." Unfortunately, Walter was the only one who had that courage. And they would say, "So what? You're just one vote. Doesn't matter." Unfortunately, he passed away in 2019. He was the last lion who did the right thing because the right thing to do. But there are no more Walter Jones anymore. Jeffrey, they're not. They just sit and shrug their shoulders, say it's the president's issue, no matter what happens. And it's going to stay that way unless the American people stand up and say, "No, if you don't decide on war and peace, because I want to hold you responsible directly if you vote the wrong way," not going to happen. They're just going to continue to run away from the issue. And it's both parties do the same thing. It's not just one or the other.
So basically, all the people that support a strong president, where the president takes these actions, and they claim to be patriots. Their vision of patriotism is a subversion of the Constitution, because the Constitution contemplated that the president would never be the person would be responsible for execution, implementation, but ultimately only with the proper authorization of the legislature.
That's absolutely correct. And I want to underscore for the audience here.
Doesn't sound very patriotic to me.
No, it's unpatriotic.
Not caring about the Constitution, and just and believing. Again, it always makes me question, why do we even celebrate July 4th and the Declaration of Independence, since essentially, we would like a strong executive, and many people find the impasses in Congress just a nuisance and want things resolved by executive order, as if maybe they would be happy if the right person was elected president. Maybe they would be happy if Congress didn't exist and the president just got to do by executive fiat and executive order everything the executive wanted to do. And many people who think this way consider themselves true patriots. That seems kind of
Yes.
patriotism to me is about not policy, but about process. So what was established was a process. There was no guarantee of an end result. The only end result that was supposed to be guaranteed was that whatever the process did, it would not violate any of our inalienable rights, and that process would be constrained by the Bill of Rights. And that's basically, so as long as the process was respected and no outcome would impair our inalienable rights and violate the rights vested in us and the limitations on government, it's all about process.
Yeah, it is. And Jeffrey, just to underscore the irony of your observation about July 4th, 1776. The American Revolution was fought on the principle that the rule of law is king. The king is not law. And if you identify the 28 grievances in the Declaration against Great Britain, they're all against the king. Kingly powers, usurpation, doing this and that, attacking, raising armies, imposing tax collectors, violating right to privacy with writs of assistance, whatever. All of them are against the king. Now, if you take the power of our current president to act unilaterally, they dwarf the powers of King George III over the colonists by orders of magnitude. Let me give you one. Presidents claim and have utilized authority to play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill anybody they wish, including American citizens. They've done so, based upon secret suspicion that the target might be a national security threat. There's no accountability, no statement of standards used to identify these people. Basically, the president can be a one-man assassination squad. Now, you combine that with a recent Supreme Court decision last July 1, 2024, in which the court basically said a president can dispatch SEAL Team 6 to assassinate an opponent, and it's immune from prosecution under the Constitution. Now, we have now crowned our president de facto with kingly powers that dwarfed the powers exercised by King George III that provoked the American Revolution. Now, if that's not come full circle, I don't know what is.
Yes, I agree with you. It's pretty horrible. So you have to some extent what we're talking about now, the limitations on what the Constitution limits presidential action. So you've also talking about from we also have an international law. So with respect to the other actions you're referring to, like in Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine and Israel and with its neighbors, both various neighbors. You have those actions. If we had a properly functioning international law system, given what the law stipulates, what would be happening now if we had a properly functioning international law system that actually was functional and not dysfunctional? What would the courts be adjudicating in first Russia with Ukraine, and then Israel with Hamas, and Israel with Hezbollah, and I don't know if Lebanon itself would have any actions against Syria. The Lebanese prime minister recently made some complaints. To Iran. The Lebanon prime minister recently made complaints about Iran's intervention in Lebanese agreement, and I think probably most people probably don't know what was agreed upon when there was a ceasefire in 2005, 2006. I can't remember what year.
Yeah.
When there was the previous Israeli Hezbollah war, that there was a ceasefire agreement that clearly has been breached, and what should have been the consequences of the severe breaches involved in these agreements. So why don't you go through them one by one, Bruce?
Okay. Let's start with, I guess it was February 2022 when Russia attacked Ukraine. It's very hard to just state international law consequences in isolation, because if I began by saying, well, this clearly under any standard, beginning with the crime against peace, the crime of aggression established in Nuremberg, this was a crime against peace. Ukraine was not threatening Russia. It was not threatening to invade Russia. Indeed, if anything, in 2014, Russia had already annexed Crimea. So if we had a proper implementation of international justice, there would have been an adjudication, presented, and the International Court of Justice would have found Russia is in violation because it's open and notorious. You could almost take judicial notice that this was a war of aggression, just like you could about the United States and Iraq in 2003. And if you had international law function like domestic law would function, then you would issue an order that could be enforced by a military force. It could be an international military force that would go and then stop and prevent Mr. Putin, and even if it needed to arrest him, hold him in contempt until the forces were withdrawn from Ukraine.
These international courts, some people have to accept the jurisdiction of the international courts. So as the U.S., I know de facto really hasn't, but de jure has U.S. signed on to the international, whatever treaty that created these international courts and these international trials. Is the U.S. a signatory to that?
No, we're not signatory to the International Criminal Court, which makes a war crime punishable. So we're not signatory. Russia's not a signatory either. Israel's not a signatory. China's not a signatory. Now,
so none of them consented to this governance structure. These countries have not consented to these governance.
But that's different. But then there's a parallel institution, Jeffrey. The International Criminal Court prosecutes cases against natural persons. The International Court of Justice handles disputes between nations.
Okay.
And it's not a criminal organ. Now, the International Court of Justice is an offshoot of the United Nations.
So therefore, all members of the United Nations have agreed to submit themselves to the
court. But that jurisdiction.
Right.
But it has the International Court of Justice. You remember, a bit like other arms of the United Nations, it's subject to the UN Security Council. It means nothing that it does has any meaning if one member of the UN Security Council vetoes any effort to enforce what it says.
Okay.
So you could imagine, no matter what the International Court of Justice says, right, about Russia attacking Ukraine being
the relevancy is there is no jurisdiction because for the superpowers basically are on the Security Council. They have this veto power. So basically they are above the law. None of this applies to them. It's just a weapon they use against other countries, but that can't be used against themselves.
That's exactly right. You've described it perfectly. And of course, now sometimes they will be proxies for others. For example, the United States would never we have an intermediate ruling that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza by the International Court of Justice, but it's had no impact. And of course, we would never permit a resolution in the UN Security Council passing that would impose any sanctions on that score, because it also would implicate us because we're providing weapons that are being used in the alleged genocide, at least preliminary found to be genocide.
So really, if you're a client and you're sponsored by anyone that has veto power at the Security Council, basically these international courts become moot and irrelevant because you have a protector at the Security Council who will make sure that these laws never apply to you. So basically, they'll only apply to the countries that all members of the Security Council believe they wanted to apply to it.
That's a perfect statement of what the law and how it really does operate. The only persons, for example, who have ever been prosecuted by the International Criminal Court are ones from Africa. They're weak countries. Nobody likes them. They got no defenders in the Security Council, so they just go forward. So you have a handful, maybe a half a dozen or something like that.
Given the fact that this is so absurd, in practice, and a legal practice, so it's a legal practice. Why do we even go through the effort of even having this exist as opposed to just abolish it, since basically it can only be used to bully the least powerful nations on the planet, that the members of the Security Council decide that they're all in agreement with, to either bully, or some of them might say, well, you might want to bully one and we might want to bully another, so we'll let you bully this one if you let us bully somebody else. Because it seems to me that that's ultimately the consequences associated with this stupidity.
No, I agree with every single syllable you said, including the intonation. I would make this observation. I think the reason why international law exists, it's because the species can't accept the depravity of its temptation to war, which is basically legalizing first-degree murder. War, you can kill people not in self-defense. War means that what in peacetime would not be self-defense and send you to prison and for life, you can do with impunity. And so international law grows up as some kind of a Pollyannish, well, maybe we're not quite as bad as we think we are. And so it's kind of there like wallpaper, but nobody really believes it means anything. There's not
It's virtue signaling. It's virtue signaling.
Yeah. It is, maybe it's like the Catholic Church, putting fig leaves on the statues or whatever, in the Vatican. So it's an effort to say, well, see, there are kind of limits. We're not so bad and brutal as other species might think. But that's all it is. If we can think of this, Jeffrey, in 1928, all the major countries of the world signed the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which made war illegal, right?
Right.
With 3 years, Japan is in Manchuria, then soon Italy's in Ethiopia, and we're all into World War II again, right? So no one paid any attention to it. It's just, but people felt good. Oh, wow, we got this Kellogg-Briand. We can now start holding parties and celebrating. The end of war has come. But it's just a joke. It's the craving of the species for this utopian existence, which is the opposite of the dystopia of war, that doesn't exist. And that's why it persists, even though it's just a complete charade. I was trying to say, there's not a single person on the planet. I've never advised a client ever, plan your daily affairs on the idea that international law will be enforced. If you do that, you're a fool. You can't. You have to plan your future on something else other than that. And that's why you find all these reports of committed war crimes. I mean, they like using the pagers and the walkie-talkies in Lebanon to blow up consumer items and kill and injure thousands or whatever. Well, it's a war crime. Well, has anything changed? No. Do you think Israel is deterred? No. Israel will do what they want to do. Other countries will do what they want to do because they know if they win the war, everything is forgiven. As it goes back to Curtis LeMay. Yeah, if we lost the war in Japan, we'd be prosecuted for war crimes, but we won. Was Curtis LeMay ever prosecuted for the firebombing of Tokyo? Never. So, and most countries believe they'll win wars, otherwise they don't enter them. So international law, again, it's like a panacea to try to at least diminish what should be the higher resistance we should have before we enter in war at all. Because like General Tecumseh Sherman said, war is hell. And let's not try to sugarcoat it.
Yeah, maybe you should talk about if you don't mind, because I think maybe a lot of people don't know that there have been efforts to outlaw wars. One of them, that actually passed was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and then there were the petitions that were written by Einstein and Bertrand Russell subsequent to World War II. In their efforts to outlaw wars. What began the process of the effort to outlaw war, that produced the Kellogg-Briand Pact?
Well, there are efforts.
Why don't you describe to people who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, I would say the first systematic effort to what they would say substitute arbitration, judicial arbitration for war, began around the turn of the century. There was, anti-imperialism at the time of the Spanish-American War, and there were efforts, and in a couple of cases, with small powers in Venezuela, some territorial disputes were adjudicated by voluntary arbitration by both sides. Indeed, we had, after the Civil War, we had the famous Alabama case. We had arbitration with Great Britain over whether they're servicing some Confederate vessels in British ports after the Civil War broke out was a violation of international law, and Britain ultimately complied with the ruling. And so initially, the treaties were calculated to require that disputes be sent to international arbitration.
Mhm.
And that was the idea, at least a provision of the League of Nations, which also had what you might call the equivalent of an international criminal court. We didn't ratify the League of Nations, in part because it would have entrusted the war power of the Constitution to our president of the United States. And Henry Cabot Lodge didn't like that, and neither did a whole lot of other people. So this movement was, well, listen, why don't we just have consensus? They readily conflated the way in which domestic law is enforced to enforce norms of civilization to international law, where you don't have any enforcement mechanism. Because everyone saw the horrors of war. They said, we must do something. Look, all the terrible things, hundreds of thousands dying on a single day, Verdun, all the other battlegrounds of World War I. And they said, well, we have to do something. But they just made it up like Fairlane. Okay, well, now this is the end of war. We never want to have another war again. But it didn't work because you're not going to the underlying principles. What is it that causes the species to so much crave power for the sake of power, fighting over a straw? It goes back to the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. So they felt, okay, well, it's World War I was so big. It was so much greater devastation and killing and deaths, added and aggravated by the Spanish flu that killed even more right afterwards. They said, we just can't do nothing. We have to at least try, even if it's make-believe. So, okay, we'll have these arbitrations and just make war illegal. But they didn't think that you're just putting it on a piece of paper. Who's going to enforce this?
Right.
And that's where we are today. People thought, Jeffrey, that, well, United Nations would succeed, where the League of Nations did not. But it hasn't, because you never addressed the underlying issue of why the species feels dominating others, and the proficiency in killing is what ought to determine the human narrative.
Well, and also the United Nations was set up to fail, or set up to accomplish, or set up to succeed on a certain level. And what do I mean by that? Well, the nations that were, why all the other nations decided to sign on, I'm not sure, but at least, for the Security Council members, they take no risk. So they get the possibility of creating a consensus to control everybody else's behavior, knowing that nobody can control their behavior.
Yes.
So it's clear why that it was good for them. I mean, so here you have a system where you sit back and you get, so how could you get the U.S. and Great Britain and Russia, and France and the other members of the Security Council to agree to subject themselves to this? Is because they agreed not to subject themselves to it. So they agreed that other people would be subjected to the decisions they make. And if they didn't like what the UN ruled, they all had the major nations, the major powers, ones who can ignore anything that the UN, any resolution to the UN resolution, or any of that, as we mentioned previously, any of their clients can ignore any other UN resolution, as long as they know they have the protector in the Security Council that gives them the authority to do it. And most nations have that protector, so they know basically they can ignore almost the UN Security Council. So who putting this together actually thought this would work, except for a way for the five powers to have hegemony over the rest of the world, wherever they have consent to do it, and the rest continues as if this organization doesn't really exist. Yeah. So the governance structure was designed to be perverse in nature. So we get perverse outcome because the design is perverse. So we should not be surprised about this outcome, because the intention of the design was to produce this type of perverse outcome.
Yeah, there were proposals, Jeffrey, at the time the UN Charter was in drafting, to prohibit a member of the Security Council from voting if they were the target of the complaint, because of the obvious conflict of interest. And they said, no way. That proposal was dead on arrival. No, we're not going to say you can't be a judge in your own case. You can be. That's what we'll sign on to this. And this carried over. this carried over, Jeffrey, to other treaties. Take, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1969, which is similar to the UN Security Council. It says 5 countries get to keep their nuclear arsenals.
Right.
To destroy the whole world. Russia, China, France, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom. But anybody else, they acquire nuclear weapons, whoa, we're going to destroy you, right? Okay. And this is supposed to be the gold standard of disarmament, right? And so since then, of course, the nuclear arsenals continue to compound.
It has nothing to do with disarmament. It has to do with preserving an oligarchy of a few nations that have certain privileges and make sure that it's a way of preempting competition. I mean,
Yes.
so it's not a matter of disarmament. It's basically saying is we're grandfathered and we don't want competition, so we're gonna outlaw anybody to be able to compete with us. And we're all in agreement that none of us, we might not get along, but there's one thing we're aligned on. None of us want competition. Okay, the competition that exists, we can't do anything about, but at least we can deter any other new competitors from entering in. So this is a win-win for all of the nations who might not get along, who have the nuclear power, that at least they keep anybody else from becoming a nuclear power.
Yes. Now it is true that in the treaty, although this provision has remained dormant ever since it was ratified over 50 years ago, all the nuclear powers agree to seek complete nuclear disarmament through negotiations. Now, there's not been a single meeting to further that obligation. I think it's Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was dormant from the outset, not gotten anywhere. Now, also,
well, those are words without meaning. Also, to sit back and say you and I agree to disarm once we come to a mutual agreement to disarm, but there's no obligation to come to a mutual agreement. So since there's no obligation to come to a mutual agreement and there's no deadline for coming to a mutual agreement and there's no consequence associated with not coming to a mutual agreement if that deadline doesn't get met, then basically those are empty words. So yeah. To have so much language put into empty words, this is just a theater to appease a certain group of people who can go and say, look, this is a path to nuclear disarmament, when we know that that's just empty words and basically just bullshit. Because I always say, for words to have meaning, they have to be collateralized by something, which means that if the words are not complied with, something really bad happens, and how bad it happens is commensurate with how bad the breach is. So there's no saying every country has to come up with a plan to disarm, and if they don't do it by a certain date, they have to pay $1 trillion. So maybe then they would give consideration to saying, I might not want to disarm, but I don't want to pay $1 trillion. So maybe whatever that dollar amount is that will induce somebody, if we think about it in terms of, I really don't want to make this about Trump, but if we take this about the issue of how it works, is if we remember the case with E. Jean Carroll, where he got a judgment of a few $1 million against him for defamation. He went out and defamed her again, and then he got a bigger judgment against defamation, and now he shut his mouth about that because he doesn't want a new judgment about defamation. So they found an amount that got him to shut his mouth, right? I mean, so the principle works. If you find enough money of damages, that you can finally have a consequence on people's behavior, because they might prefer to behave properly, because the cost of breaching, it just gets to a point where it becomes too expensive to breach. So the original amount of the defamation was not sufficient to have Trump. And again, I don't want to make this about Trump, just to illustrate that point, is that one level of damages might not be sufficiently deterrent in nature. So if you increase that level of damages, you might get to a dollar amount, that where it is a sufficient deterrent. And maybe if we wanted to if people were sincere about accomplishing that objective, they would write a document consistent with making it difficult to breach rather than easy to breach. So these documents basically had no consequences associated with not coming to an agreement.
Yeah, but I think that the difference structurally, Jeffrey, in the domestic situation like Trump and Jean Carroll, is that here we have institutions that can enforce the judgment.
Right there's nobody to enforce the judgments.
Yeah,
Yes.
you see, internationally, there isn't any such system like that.
Well,
You're going to have to invade a country to collect the money, right?
In a world now with, smart contracts, you could enforce it. I mean, even before that, you can put up you can have the money, you can have the damages put into an escrow account, and here's $1 trillion in escrow account. If I don't reach an agreement by this date, then the escrow agent that can't be controlled by any of the principles of the transaction could then enforce the contract. But it reinforces my point that there has to be collateral, and the collateral can't be controlled by either of the parties to the agreement. So there are ways of structuring an agreement where, if you're serious about understanding the consequences of the breach, that that if you breach, bad stuff will happen to you, that it will be enforced. And the best way to enforce it is with this collateral that you ceded control the moment that you've executed the agreement. But we don't do that.
No, because I think in part because they wouldn't, no sovereign would sign on, because you're correct, Jeffrey, that you could structure that is, you could have an international agreement says every party upon signatory shall deposit X trillion dollars into some third trust account. And if there's a breach, we just go after the money, right? But no one's going to give that money away, in advance.
I tell you, when I negotiate deals, and I've negotiated a lot of deals, whenever behavior is in complete control, there's certain circumstances that are beyond the scope and control of the parties to the agreement. So you have good faith. You can't predict the future, and there are certain things. Many events are contingent events, and you should never have any expectation that any party can control contingent events. But there are certain behaviors that are certainly within the control of each of the parties. That's 100% within their control, and almost anything that's 100% in the control of another party, I always demand, high liquidated damages in case there's a breach. For me, I know I'm not going to breach, so I don't value the right to breach. And it's always my way of discovering who values the right to breach. So if somebody tells me they're not going to do certain things, and I know it's completely in their control, and then I say, okay, you agree that it's going to be completely in your control, so given the fact that it's in your control, if you do it, you've done it with knowledge, you've done it with malice, you've done it intentionally. And to the extent that you've done it with full knowledge and you've done it intentionally, then I want to collect my liquidated damages, and I don't want it to be difficult for me to collect my liquidated damages. So, and if they say no, I know I'm dealing with somebody who values highly the right to breach, and there's somebody I know I'm not going to get a deal done with, and I'm happy not to get a deal done with anyone who values highly the right to breach. I want to do a deal with people who are honorable people, and honorable people don't have a problem with putting up money behind promises that they make where they know it's 100% in their control to keep their word. So, because if they don't keep their word, then, they know they're doing it. They're doing it willingly, and they're doing it intentionally. So for me, I don't even waste my time on a contract where another party is not willing to control their own behavior, and they don't want to be accountable for their own behavior.
Yeah.
So, but we engage in all these contracts that are basically just a complete waste of time, because we're taking a counterpart risk that's a bad counterpart risk, that when they become a bad counterpart risk, we ultimately have no remedy. So if that's the case, why even sign a document to begin with?
I think it's because the politicians think that they can delude the people. Well, it looks like, hey, I signed a treaty. We'll do it. I mean, that's why the Kellogg-Briand Treaty was celebrated, politically. My gosh. And people are eager, to believe in fairy tales if they think it's good. And so this is an effort by the government officials to exploit that vulnerability, if you will, that prayer for peace, like Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Okay, well, maybe we now have it. And that's why they do it, because at least it works temporarily, even if the results, come home to roost and show it's not worth anything. So that's why we still talk about international law. People think, well, maybe there are restraints, even when there are not, because people would rather undergo the deceit that there are because it makes them feel better. It's a little bit like a placebo effect, Jeffrey. You take something, it says it's going to make you better. It really is just no different than water. And now you feel a little bit better. Now, and that's what politicians are about. Anything that can fool their constituents and think they're doing something constructive, they'll take advantage of. Because it's obvious from experience that international law is just a scrap of paper. You can describe international law as it was 2,000 years ago, expressed by Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. That's international law. 101, right? It hasn't changed for 2,000 years. They give little new euphemisms for it, but that's basically where it still is today. And also, even with regard to some of the standards of international law, it's clearly a war crime, Jeffrey, to knowingly target a civilian and cause a civilian deaths. But the military will say, for example, in Gaza, well, everybody we target is Hamas. Even the babies in incubators are Hamas. So we know we're not guilty of war crimes because we're not definitely targeting civilians. We're only targeting Hamas, as though Hamas, they wear signs or something or numbers like they're football players. Or another principle of international, it's a war crime to undertake an action which creates a threat of civilian deaths and destruction of civilian property disproportionate to the legitimate military objective. Okay, well, who defines the importance of the military objective? It's the perpetrator. Well, the proportionality standard, it never is met, because the perpetrator says, yeah, we were going to win the war if we did this, when we could argue, oh, we did Hiroshima and Nagasaki because that enabled us to win the war.
When the U.S. fought Iraq in 2003, when we had like the month of bombings, what were the targets that the U.S. bombed? And that a lot of it was infrastructure, right? Correct.
Yeah. The electrical grid and all these other things, sure. But I mean, the electrical grid means, okay, so the hospitals can't function, you can't get food, you can't have power, you don't have anything else. It's a little bit like Israel, the defense minister said, you know what the siege is going to be? No food, no water, no medicine. No food, no water? How does people survive without any food or water?
That was based, that from what I understand, that's like military tactic 101. When you go in and you go war against the nation, you attack its ability to make war, and you also do psychological trauma to its population. So you attack infrastructure. Isn't that a common practice in many wars?
It is, but I'm saying that if you read the language of international law, well, you're basically saying you're purposely addressing civilian targets and civilian persons, and that's disproportionate to the so-called military objective. Now, the military would respond, well, winning the war is everything. And therefore, anything we do is proportionate because it's all aims at ending the war, right? So the standards are so elusive and so manipulable. It's just whatever you say. So you have a defense if you win the war. If you lose, you don't have a defense. That's what it amounts to.
So I'm only trying to. I'm not doing this to defend Israel because I believe in the non-aggression principle, and I don't. Yeah. And I also don't like any war. So I think all wars are wars of choice. I don't think any of these things are wars of survival or wars of necessity. I think they're all wars of choice. So I don't approve of any of them. But to the extent that there are many people criticizing Israel for how it's executed the war, almost any other nation would have executed a war similar to the way Israel has executed.
Absolutely, Jeffrey. Let me give you this example. When we go back to Iraq, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is asked by Leslie Stahl on CBS's 60 Minutes, these economic sanctions and siege against Iraq, you've caught 500,000 Iraqi babies under 5 years old. And she says, it's worth it.
Yes.
So if I'm Netanyahu, I said, who's the United States lecturing us? No, this is your Secretary of State. And we know they have not killed 500,000 Gazan babies, not even close to what we did in Iraq. So you're right. I'm not trying to suggest, because my view is all countries act the same in wartime. No one has a moral standard. They all do the same thing. So to stand up and pontificate, well, this is worse than that, come on, it's a joke. That's what I say. Even at the Nuremberg trial, charging the Nazis with a catch and force massacre that perpetrated by the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union sitting as the judges. There's a joke.
Yeah, Brown University did a study of how many people died as a consequences of the war in Iraq, and their number, at least the last time I saw it a couple of years ago, when I read the first article about it, I read it while I was on a flight, and I got so upset about it. I wrote a piece that I think I might have put on Medium. I wrote it like in 15 minutes because I was like so angry when I read it. I just wrote something very impassioned, and when I landed, I sent it to somebody to put on in their Medium page. But I had read that there were, at that point in time, like almost 4 million people died as a consequence of the Iraq War. We're only a small percentage of that really were direct or indirect combatants. Everybody else was what we like to call collateral damage, because that's a nice term that we don't want to confront ourselves with the type of human suffering that we've caused. So we just call this collateral damage, and that sounds like a nice concept, and that you don't have to worry about it. It's just a consequence of doing the right thing. So it's trivial in nature. So we trivialize it by using a language that trivializes it, which I think is horrible. So so we don't take a look at the amount of civilian deaths caused, by our military actions, and who knows, and we don't know, we don't have any really reliable statistics, to my knowledge, of what's going on with how many Russians have died and how many Ukrainians have died.
Yeah.
In the current war, we have no, I don't know if we'll ever know. Maybe if the war ends, we'll have some approximate number that might be a reasonable approximation, but we'll never really know. So these are all terrible tragedies. Now, this is something that you've mentioned in the past, but not on one of our podcasts, I don't think. But even these treaties that we're a party to, like NATO, that ultimately, when we sign these treaties, we cannot really delegate the right that if a NATO country is attacked, our signing NATO treaty doesn't itself automatically mean that we can have to defend that country, that we would still need a declaration of war if we wanted to do it the constitutional way. Of course, Congress could go to the American people and say, nobody will ever trust us if we don't honor these treaties. But my point is, there's no automatic triggering of the fact that because we are part of this treaty, that there's an obligation that the treaty can force us to go to war against our own constitution. So
yeah, it's absolutely right. And Jeffrey, the reason why this is an important example is because it shows how we have really entered the age of George Orwell in misinterpreting and torturing the meaning of words and statutes and treaties as they were understood. But let me just give you a very brief background. Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of War when, Secretary of Navy, I believe, at the time of the Versailles Treaty, the League of Nations, when Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate said, we are not going to ratify the League of Nations because it gives the president unilateral power to take us to war to defend the boundaries of another country. And the treaty shipwrecked. Okay, Franklin was very aware of that. So when he was proposing the UN, he knew there's no way that we're ever going to get the UN treaty ratified. It's going to go to the bottom of the deep blue sea if it's like the League of Nations. And therefore, under the UN Participation Act, only Congress could authorize the creation of a military force to be used under UN auspices in military action. Only Congress could do that. Then you jump forward, and that's 1946. Then the NATO treaty is 1949. And in the NATO treaty, in Article 5 says that an attack on one shall be treated or as an attack on all. But then Article 11 says the implementation, the reaction to Article 5 shall be in accord with the constitutional processes of the signatory countries. And when Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State at the time, went and testified what the meaning of Article 5 was before the Senate Foreign Relations, he said, of course, no, we're not automatically a war if a NATO country is attacked, because only Congress can take us to war, and Congress, which means both the Senate and the House. Right. Remember, only the Senate's involved in treaties, not the House and the Senate agree to declare war. He makes that statement, It's in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee report. Harry Truman adopts it. Everybody understands that. 100% of the people understand that. Today, where we are, Jeffrey, people think that's a fringe view. I said, and I have written probably 20 letters to the New York Times and Washington Post when they repeatedly report the falsehood that under Article 5, then we automatically at war and we come to defend any NATO member. That's why Sweden and Finland wanted to get in, because then we basically are their mercenaries, if they're attacked. I said, that's not true. And I give them all the citations. This is Dean Acheson. He's not a pinko. This is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is what was stated. This is what Article 11 says. This is what Harry Truman says. Nothing. They will not write it. That you cannot get a reputable outfit other than BitChute to say openly, Article 5 of NATO does not commit us to war if a NATO member is attacked. Congress has to declare war. It's taboo. It's censored from the establishment media.
Well, that makes one of the reasons I'm proud to be affiliated with BitChute is the fact that nothing gets censored, we believe that everybody should have the right to communicate whatever they believe or whatever they think is, especially factual stuff, but in opinions, and that they should be uncensored. Everybody has not only freedom of speech but freedom of reach, and we let the people decide, and we want them to have more information than less, and every individual as an adult needs to filter it themselves. They don't need a child needs an adult to filter. The concept. The concept of mainstream media is they're guardians of truth. So who needs a guardian is a child needs a guardian. So it's a very paternalistic or maternalistic model. I don't want to be accused of being sexist. So it's either paternalist or maternalistic model, where you need a guardian, to filter out and create a narrative, because we're children that need to be spoon-fed, information. No, I think the thing, unique about BitChute is that we reject that. We think we treat everyone as a member of the BitChute community as being an adult, and it's their job as an adult to filter it out themselves. It's not our job to filter out on their behalf. It's their job to filter out on their own behalf. So I have a comment here. Maybe you want to address it, maybe not. I'll want to address it, but I'll give you the first shot at it. The comment goes, Russia isn't killing as many civilians in Ukraine as Israel is killing in Gaza, and that war has gone on longer, and there is a larger population. Current estimates show that 10% of the Gaza population is dead or missing and presumed dead. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, we're just talking in reference to international law. As you rightly point out, getting the correct casualty figures is a very, very challenging proposition, because we don't have peace. People can't go in there and count bodies. People can be dead under rubble, whatever. But as a matter of international law, the actual number of casualties is relevant, but it's not at all proof that either a war crime is committed or not being committed. The massacre of about 800 Serbian Muslims at Srebrenica was held to be genocide, even though it was a tiny fraction of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews. And so the critical element here is the intent behind the killing, whether there was any legitimate military reason or not. I think that I don't like to get involved in these kind of statistical measures, because I think every life is precious. Stalin once dismissively said, well, one death is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic, very callously. So I just want to protect everybody's life. That shouldn't be extinguished, exterminated in time of war without treasure, whether it's someone in Gaza, whether in Ukraine or otherwise. We all are the same in the eyes of God.
I agree with that. And again, I'm anti-war, but I think, to the extent that I always think many people, when they put these statistics together, they don't provide sufficient context when they put these there's a lot of cherry picking of information. What's the challenge? What's the challenge that Israel fighting Gaza that's different than the logistics of Russia fighting Ukraine? The difference in the logistics are that Ukraine has an army, and it's basically two armies fighting each other. Okay, Hezbollah basically is a guerrilla force. It's a guerrilla force that spent one is Gaza is much more densely populated than Ukraine. So and where they're fighting, in the part of the Ukraine-Russian war, they're not fighting in the most heavily populated, densely populated areas. So you're going to obviously have more civilian casualties when you're fighting when the population is significantly denser. So the other thing is that the Hamas has basically, as Hezbollah has done, is they've spent over a decade building a tunnel infrastructure, so they're all underground. So if you're going to fight an enemy that basically their whole infrastructure for war making capacity, is either underground or embedded in a civilian population, the tactics of fighting a war where basically the military force is all underground, their arms are underground, they run a lot of operations by coming underground, they have a very sophisticated tunnel network, and in a dense population where they intentionally use human shields, as opposed to this is a battle of two nation states, one with a military that are fighting in areas that might not necessarily have the same type of civilian populations. So the nature of the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine is different than the confrontation of Israel and Gaza. So and Israel, on the most part, puts out warnings when they're going to attack certain areas. They generally give notice to the civilian population to the extent that the civilian population is able to relocate somewhere else. But basically, if Israel was to avoid basically Hamas has organized its infrastructure so that for Israel to defeat Hamas, they have to kill a lot of civilians in the process.
Yeah,
so,
but Jeffrey, I'm not disputing your observations, the distinctions, but I think it's also useful to remember that Netanyahu and Israel supported Qatar providing Hamas with money for years. It wanted Hamas to develop as a rival to the PLO because they thought, and this is Netanyahu said, listen, if we have Hamas there, then they'll never pressure us for a two-state solution because no one will want to have Hamas there as a running a new nation state. So, I mean, you can see, and I'm not trying to suggest that any politician is less cynical than the other. They're all cynical. They're all there for power for the sake of power. But can you imagine why Netanyahu is telling Qatar, yeah, you can go ahead and you can give money to Hamas. We want it to thrive. We want it to be a rival for the Palestinian Authority. Of course, they succeeded on that score. Hamas hated the Palestinian Authority. So it's that's why, no one has the high moral ground, in my judgment. Politicians are sociopaths. They want power for the sake of power. They don't care who gets crushed in the process. And that's why we say, yeah, let's get out of trying to suggest any motivation is higher or less evil than the others. They're all the same because they're all politicians and they all want and lust for power for its own sake.
Yeah, the point I wanted to make is that any other nation that decided to prosecute a war that Israel is prosecuting now against Gaza, given the dynamics of the nature, they would not be fighting it any differently than Israel is. The intent in many of these comments, I believe, is to demonize that Israel is uniquely evil when it engages in war. I mean,
I think they're all. I don't take that view, Jeffrey. My view is all countries are equally evil, and the whole reason why we were born basically as a miracle is we recognize that. Madison recognized that we're not made of any other DNA. We have to give the war power to Congress because it won't go to war except in self-defense because it doesn't aggrandize power. We need to make our glory liberty and the march of the mind, not the march of the foot soldier, because otherwise we're going to go the way of the dinosaurs like all these other empires. That was a miracle. But they didn't think, oh my gosh, we're God's new chosen people. We can do whatever we want. We have DNA. They said, no, we're depraved as everybody else. We need to check ourselves. Now that's unique, I think, in the history of mankind. You have leaders recognizing we're flawed creatures. We can't trust ourselves. George Washington, the first president, I can't go to war on my own, Congress has to deliberate and decide before I can do anything. Can you imagine any leader of any country today saying that? No, certainly not. The current Harris, Trump, no way. So anyway, I'm just saying that's my view. They're all on the same plane. And we need to struggle to try to make sure we preserve everybody's life and not get on the and suggest that, well, this one's more moral than that one. War is immoral under all circumstances.
Right.
It legalizes first-degree murder, and that's never acceptable.
Yeah. And again, it characterizes people, as who die, who as collateral damage. We end up killing. I guess most modern wars have killed a lot more civilians than they have military combatants.
Yeah.
And everybody's attacked, and everybody aggressively attacks civilian infrastructure, and everybody engages in psyops to basically demoralize the local population, so that they want because people want a quick end to the war. So you quick end to the war is you scare the shit out of the people, not the military. You scare the shit out of the people, so that country loses popular support for the war. You think that's a fair observation?
It is, but I don't think it works. That's what we thought we would do.
I don't think it works, but it's what everybody does. That's what I'm saying.
No, right. That's right. Even though it's stupid, that's what everybody does. Today, Jeffrey, even today in Laos, we spent 10 years of secret war in Laos to drop more bombs in Laos than on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and on World War II. You have hundreds of kids die or are maimed each year by unexploded ordnance exploding because we dropped that many bombs on Laos. Most people don't even know that. This is the so-called collateral damage you're working with. Little kids,
Right.
5-year-olds, walking out in the field, they step on unexploded ordnance that B-52s dropped over 10 years. For Laos, a national security threat to the United States. And people shrug their shoulders. Nobody even knows it exists. That's our weapons.
I don't know what our current droning policy is, but I know in the beginning, from what I read, from what I read in the beginning when we were droning, we would drone some targets. From what I understand, a lot of those targets we drone were actually not enemy combatants. And then in regions, they defined an enemy combatant, so in certain areas in that region, everybody has a gun. And we were defining everybody with a gun as an enemy combatant in a society where everybody carries a gun, because you have to, for survival, you have to carry a gun. And not only that, they would drone somebody who had a gun, and by having a gun, they would deemed an enemy combatant. And then whoever went to deal with those bodies after, they assumed they also must be terrorists as well. So basically, if some father is out there, doing something, and he has a gun to protect himself from a country that has lawless and has a gun for personal protection, not because they're a terrorist, not because they're enemy combatant, but it's for their own personal protection, their family. And they go out there and they have a gun that then they're saying, oh, gun, enemy combatant, let's drone them. Then if their mother and father and siblings and kids come out to get the body because they want to bury the body, they assume those are also terrorists because the person with the gun is a terrorist, and anybody who's concerned about that terrorist also must be a terrorist, and we drone them as well. So this was our policy. So going back to the fact is, anyone who engages in war, okay, or anyone who supports an act of war, for me, has ceded their right to judge anybody else on how they prosecute a war, because they're willing to accept their own country to prosecute a war in usually immoral wars fought in an immoral way. And like you, I don't condone any war. I don't condone any act of aggression. It's all wrong, and unfortunately, there is no mechanism that we can have as a species to basically outlaw it, except our own personal behavior. When we become so offended by war that if we vote out of power anybody who decides to go to war, then maybe we will improve as a species. But right now, we celebrate. When I go to ball games and those planes fly over, people are in awe of displays of military power. So power, we want to project power. We want to project strength, right? So this is what, so my favorite word in the English language is tariff. The fact that I assumed if you would have asked George Washington or James Madison or the people, what's your favorite word in the English language, whatever, might have been liberty. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
liberty.
nobody comes up with liberty today. It's about power. That's not, and when in my reference to, Trump and his tariff, I don't mean to direct at Trump. All politicians, they like to project power. That's what
Jeffrey, let me interject because Nancy Pelosi. I meant Nancy Pelosi's latest memoir. You know what the title is? The Art of Power. I wrote a book for it. It said, "Where's justice?" James Madison writes in Federalist 51, "Justice is the end of civil society. It's the end of government. Justice." And here at Nancy Pelosi, it's about power. You're exactly right. Justice and liberty are out the window. I said, really? What happened? This is what the framers thought we were about, liberty and justice. That's why they ran a revolution. And now you turned yourself back into King George III. And these people are so oblivious. They read nothing. They know nothing. They don't have any understanding of how absurd that they look. The art of power? No. The art of justice is what this country's about.
Right. And until as a people, we decide to enforce it through the ballot box and actually choosing candidates. One of the things I've said, I don't even know if this will work. Again, I don't vote, so I don't think there's any utility in voting. But to the extent that anybody finds any utility in voting, I made a suggestion that it's been attributed to Einstein, that they say the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and expecting a different result. So some people said Einstein never really said that, but it's been attributed to him. And so we keep going to the polls, voting the same people, and we expect, the same process, the same parties, and we expect a different outcome. So I think we should try something different. How can we send a message to this duopoly of power, to change their incentive structure? And the idea that I've come up with, maybe many people will think it's a bad idea, is that I think people should just vote every incumbent out of office. So how would the incentives change, and how less influential money would be in politics if you knew you couldn't keep somebody in power, by donating, hundreds of millions of dollars to their campaign, if you couldn't keep them in power? What would be the change in the dynamics of the system if you just basically said, you're one and done, you're in office once, and if people just kept rotating out, members, then we'd have no permanent class in Washington. We'd have the incentive to bribe these people who are not there for a long period of time so they can accumulate a lot of political power. If you have one term, you're not going to accumulate much political power. And we'll have the people who seek office will have a very different incentive structure because they know the likelihood they'll only be there one term. I don't know if that'll work, but clearly what we're doing now is not working.
No, it gets worse every year. But my view of the matter is this, Jeffrey. One, I do think I vote, but I have not for 30 years ever voted for any of the major parties. I write in James Madison, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. I just want to send a signal. I'm still engaged, but you don't putting up anything that I'm going to vote for. But I'm available to vote if you put up somebody. So I think the voting, but not for any of the major parties, still can have a purpose. But more important, I believe that if we want to try to change the incentive structure, we need to find a candidate. And I've searched, still not, like Diogenes, still looking for an honest man with his lamp, for a candidate who will make the entire campaign on what we've talked about today. We got to get rid of this military-industrial security complex, trillions of dollars going down the drain, government spying on the not yet guilty, liberty being suppressed. It's all about power. And if we could just make that one candidate, put all the efforts to make that the leitmotif of the campaign and win, that will frighten 100 or 200 others. Say, oh, wow, man, especially defeating an incumbent. But you've got to find somebody who understands this stuff, and that means that before they're age 80 or something, and are engaged and are able to articulate this and knows the history, because they do think if you found the proper candidate, they would vote for James Madison. Madison was elected, but they aren't seeing anybody who's articulating and have the gall. The last one who did was Walter Jones and the military industrial complex. Even though he had a military base in his district, they tried to get rid of him. They could never do that. He won handily every time, no matter how much money they spent against him. And this is in a military district, and he's on Armed Services Committee. But if we can find somebody, if we can find a new James Madison out there, make it the centerpiece of the campaign. That's all he talks about. Getting rid of the money. We need to make justice and liberty and the march of the mind and the opportunity to march your own drummer. That's the centerpiece of what America is. And win just in one district out of 435. It would be an earthquake politically. But we're still looking for that one candidate. But anybody want to volunteer? I got a group that's willing to support you.
I'm certainly not raising my hand. Well, I had hoped, in full disclosure, I had hoped that I actually, as someone who has been, apolitical, for almost my entire adult life, I did sponsor a lunch with a group of friends of mine in New York for Bobby Kennedy Jr. And I became interested in his campaign when he advocated for Bitcoin, and I listened to the reason for why he became interested in Bitcoin and when he appreciated the value of Bitcoin. And so I contacted somebody that knew somebody in his campaign. I had a Zoom with him. I invited him to a lunch that I hosted with about a little over 20 people. And when I introduced him at the lunch, I basically I give a small talk to my friends, before he spoke, and I basically said, I don't know whether I'm actually going to vote. I don't know whether I'm, but even the concept that I'm thinking about voting, that I would consider voting for you, and because of his advocacy for Bitcoin, but also because my hope was, as a candidate, he wanted to change the conversation in DC. So it's not that I necessarily was ideologically aligned with him. At least I thought, he was somebody that was talking about in many aspects of government, of shrinking government. He was talking about fiscal responsibility. So he was a candidate that piqued my interest, in the sense of, maybe I finally found somebody that I could vote for. And unfortunately, he ran a campaign that could never resonate. And I think it's unfortunate, because he kind of got demonized for talking about issues that I think were important issues that needed to be addressed. And so as the mainstream media, as the narrative, the Guardians usually do, when you're a threat to their guardianship, they attack you and they demonize you, and many of the public are influenced because you don't have the same ability to present your case on your behalf as they have to present a case against you. So it's a prosecution without really the ability to provide an equal defense, which I think is in itself a terribly unjust thing. When you're indicting somebody and you're prosecuting a case against somebody, and then you prosecute a case with somebody on many things, on the most part, are not really evidence that would never be admissible in a court of law, and then you never let a counter argument to really appear, or you do what like Brett Baer did with Kamala, and basically, interrupt her throughout the interview, which really is not giving the other person a time to talk. And that's sort of like an adversarial, interview should not be adversarial. They should be trying to evoke everyone listening to get a better understanding of the person you're speaking with. So I had some hope that maybe I might find a candidate that I might not ideologically agree with, but at least somebody who I would not be embarrassed occupied the White House. So I like him a lot as a human being. So but I don't have the option of now voting for him, directly, as opposed to being part of an administration. with that. And so I'm going to, again, sit on the sidelines this year like I have for so many other years, waiting for the year that I might be enthusiastic about actually, as you said, voting for somebody, that you want to vote for. I never want to go to the poll voting against anyone. And I don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils. I want to vote for somebody who I actually think reflects, as you said, Madisonian, Jeffersonian values. I'm more Jeffersonian. I think you're a little more Madisonian, but so I want someone to reflect, the values of the people who.
I can't, Jeffrey. I can't resist. When Jefferson had a tough call, he called James Madison and said, "Jimmy, you got to come here. You got to help me out." Jefferson had a better pen. He was more felicitous in expression. But when it came to hard thinking and he needed to oppose Alexander Hamilton, he called Jimmy Madison, and Madison did the task for him. And Madison convinced Jefferson on numerous occasions. Remember, he served 8 years as a Secretary of State. No,
yes,
Thomas, you got instincts, but this is a little bit too wrong. That's why I'm in favor of Madison. He's more measured. I think Jefferson sometimes thought that the species was a little better than it really was. Because remember, it was Madison who writes in the Federalist Papers, no, men aren't angels. They're devils. That's why we have separation of powers. Anyway, that's why I prefer Madison over Jefferson, because he's stayed earthbound all the time. Jefferson sometimes got us unearthbound, and it's electrifying, his words, but, it doesn't correspond to reality. And James Madison's stuck his policies to the ground.
Well, Bruce, as I always like to give the guest the last word. So what would be the last message that you'd like to communicate to anyone who might see this podcast?
Well, I do think, to go back of your last observations, Jeffrey, that is, if we really want to see serious change, and we know no serious change really happens overnight. That means the people who are on the podcast recognize that evils that we confront, it's not just here, internationally, the constant warfare. I mean, most of the time we don't have any concept of how ubiquitous it is. I mean, all my clients are involved in some form or another. Uyghurs, the Karen and Myanmar, they're all being destroyed, Biafrans, by countries, and we are either directly or indirectly involved in giving weapons or whatever. If this is going to change, we need at least to start with our political culture at home and in the schools, especially in the textbooks. We got to get away from this idea, and it's not just Nancy Pelosi, that no, the end all and be all of politics is power. It's not. It's justice. It's justice means checking, means having an equilibrium so no minority gets oppressed. That's what this country was formed on, even though we had many shortcomings at the outset. That was our aspiration. And we threw it away, when we decided we wanted to be an empire and wanted to be Colossus and Caesar ruling the world. Remember Hillary Clinton? We came, we saw, he died. Like she was now a reincarnation of Julius Caesar. And she thought that would be applauded. The founding fathers would have said, "Are you kidding? We've tried to get away from Julius Caesar, and you're now embracing Julius Caesar." So I'd want the audience to think about our ways, the school level, the textbook level, school board level, the dialogue, and talking and thinking about members of Congress, the Senate, writing to the president, communicating however you will with social media. No, we don't want power over liberty. Liberty, justice is what we want. We don't need to rule the world to make us a shining beacon on a hill.
I'd like to ask you one question, a very articulate conclusion you had, but I have a question because it made me stimulate a question from that. For those who are watching, do you have a brief suggested reading list of materials that you would encourage people to read?
Yes, I do. Jeffrey, I have a 100-book reading list, and you can find that on my website. The website is www.lawofficesofbrucefein.com. And I have a 100-book reading list, and that's where you ought to start. There's more to come, but I can guarantee you, if you can get through that reading list, I think you'll be certainly more equipped than anybody in the establishment today to understand power and how we need to control it.
Well, that what you just said now then maybe stimulates another question on my part. Would you like to have future conversations on Fine Points to discuss some of those books on your reading list, on
Yes,
how
definitely.
you chose those books, and the description of the books that you chose. And you can't choose all 100 in one conversation, but if you can choose one or two in a conversation, and on how you chose the books, and to begin talking about a few of them, and so you could at least introduce to people who might not want to read the whole book, that can get a summary.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd be delighted to do that. I said one of my favorites, because it's very relatively short. It's Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, where he goes through understanding masterfully the psychology that thinks, oh, we can make the world perfect, and it keeps being upset, and why they lived in Happy Valley and they went all over the world, and it's a very, very, very masterful penetration of how our psychology works, and what we need to strive for if we want to be more than animals. But that's just one. But the answer is yes, Jeffrey. And what I'll do after this, I'll send you maybe a half a dozen that we can look at least as a start, if the audience thinks that they would be interested in that, to kind of get at least a little bit of a foothold into philosophy, at least my philosophy, that I think is what undergirded the entire Declaration of Independence, Constitution, that made us different from other countries, at least at the beginning.
Well, that would be great, and I look forward to receiving that half a dozen or so names and titles, and then we can mutually choose amongst that list, and begin having a conversation about those books. So thank you again very much. Always stimulating to speak with you, Bruce.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for the audience. Thanks for hanging in there. I know it's a long time, but what you're doing is the Lord's work, and I think that you and your children will cherish these challenges to understanding why we exist and what's the right thing to do. It's not oftentimes that you confront these issues in the mass media world that we confront today, but it is enduring, and you won't find it a wasting asset.
Thank you so much. Good, excellent words, wise words.
Okay. Thanks, Jeffrey. Talk to you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.